to the Public Accounts Committee on Wednesday, the 11th of July 2018. We're here to look at the progress of the Customs Declaration Service, which is an important programme to get Britain prepared for customs post-Brexit. It's to replace the Chief programme. We've looked at this a number of times before, so I won't go through all the background detail. Our witnesses today are Jim Harrer from HMRC. Just to give you your full title, Jim. The Deputy Chief seems to change every time we come. The Deputy Chief Executive and Second Permanent Secretary at HMRC. John Thompson, the Chief Executive and Permanent Secretary at HMRC. You all seem to have two titles. I don't know whether that's reflected in your productivity. And Kevin Franklin, who's the Director of Customs Transformation at HMRC. Just one of the 17 major projects that HMRC is dealing with. Before we kick into the main session, though, Mr Thompson, obviously there was a very big meeting in Chequers over the weekend, on Friday. The Prime Minister came out announcing a new approach to customs that she's hoping to get through Europe. You keep reassuring us things are going fine. Are you ready to deal with this new programme and plan that's come out of Chequers?
Are we ready for whatever's going to be published tomorrow in the white paper?
Yeah. Well, you must have had some conversations, one would hope, with ministers before it was agreed.
Well, to be transparent, Jim was at Chequers, and we've been fully involved in the development of the third option. We have to re-evaluate what exactly that means for existing programmes, not this so much, but definitely the border systems programme, which is referred to in the report. So giving you assurances that it is ready is a bit difficult until we can be really clear and transparent with you about what exactly it means and what the timetable is.
Right, but you've been involved in the preparation of it, so you've been helping to shape it, are you saying, so that you think that the Prime Minister's made an announcement that is deliverable?
Yes.
Okay, by March 2019?
Well, I think you have to wait until tomorrow, sorry.
Obviously, you can't announce what's in the white paper.
Well, I think you
need to give us a bit of reassurance that we've been talking about CDS and Chief for some time. We've been talking about border and preparedness for Brexit on that for some time. Yes. You keep reassuring us things are on track. We've got the report in front of us today, which tells us where the progress is and where the gaps and where the worries are. And yet there's a whole other bit of work for you to do that's just popped up last weekend. So this is on top of the 17 huge major pieces of work that you're dealing with. So, I mean, that's just the biggest issues. Are you going to be ready? And can you practically deliver on the Prime Minister's promise?
So, to be clear with you, for HMRC, reducing to one option from what is currently two, it would definitely be beneficial. Because if you remember, we were running with both the highly streamlined customs arrangement and the new customs partnership, and we had people running both of those. So the government policy narrowing down to one option will, to some extent, allow us to streamline some of those programmes and concentrate resources.
So what functionality will you need in different programmes, and when will you need to have them ready by in order to deliver this third?
So I think you're doing really well at chipping away at asking me about government policy that hasn't been announced.
Well, I think it was announced. It was, as far as we're concerned, it was announced last week. The principles.
So I think. To come back to what we came to talk about, you need a customs declaration service in whatever option is required for leaving the European Union. Over and above that, there are a range of other projects you could need depending on what the overall strategic approach is that the government's going to enter into the negotiations for. The core programme that would change is the border systems programme, which is referred to in here. If you'd like us to, we could go through and tell you what would be retained and what would not, using the table which has been provided by
we will certainly get on to that, because I'm just clear that you're introducing upgrades to CDS, for example, that are quite tight to point of actual take-up. So what other kind of upgrades to CDS or other systems will you have to now be looking at as a result of the announcement which the detail will be available tomorrow? I mean, where are you going to have to make changes, and how quickly can they kick in?
CDS would remain as it is, but it's figure 6 on page 20 of the report.
Yep, got it here.
If you'd like, I think Jim can run you down that table and tell you what we would need to retain and what we would
the Chequers, the new announcement that's coming out in detail,
and what we could stop work on if that proceeded.
Okay.
Would that help,
Mr. Harrer? That would be very helpful.
Jim.
Thank you.
Yes. So the new customs model involves enabling the UK to set its own tariffs. but in addition to administer the EU's tariffs for goods that are entering the UK that are destined for the EU. That will, that was a feature of one of the previous models. It will undoubtedly require some change to CDS so that we can operate 2 tariffs. That is something that we had already been scoping. The Border Systems Programme is largely projects that were relevant for highly streamlined customs arrangement, or would be relevant for if there was no deal. And obviously, as part of the decision of Cabinet last week, we will be continuing to plan for no deal. But the nature of some of these will change. I mean, the key ones that would still be required for the new customs model are that we would continue to wish to accede to the Common Transit Convention. The UK has already applied to accede to that. We are going through the negotiations as we speak, and that is relevant to the new model. In addition, for tariffs and quotas, because the UK will be setting its own tariffs and its own trade policy, our system will need to be able to receive tariffs from the Department of International Trade, as well as in the future tariffs from the EU, and that is a bit of development of CDS that will need to be done once the existing schedule of releases have been landed. Similarly, for trade statistics, we will continue to have a project for that because there will be some changes required both to distinguish UK and EU trade, but also because the EU will want to monitor us to the extent.
So we're looking at figure 6.
Yes, that's correct. Sorry, I'm starting at the bottom.
Because I was just trying to work out where you were on this.
Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. So the first...
we'll need something for ro-ro ferries.
Yes, so the first 6 of those, in figure 6, starting in ro-ro and going down to safety and security, are not required for the new customs model, if that's what is negotiated, because generally speaking, they relate to if controls were introduced at the UK-EU border, and one of the features of the new model is that it would not involve introducing those controls, so those projects would not be needed for the new model, but the bottom 3, to some extent, will be required for the new model.
Okay, so that's quite... So you've still got the other 3 to do, and you don't know the final detail until
negotiations.
Does that clarify the...
That does clarify, and I think what we'll do, we'll come back to that. And I know Jeffrey, forgot to say, I do need to ask Mrs Keegan to declare an interest.
Yes, I'd just like to declare an interest that my husband is a senior exec for Fujitsu.
Okay. So Jeffrey Clifton-Brown, then.
Mr Thompson, if you were able to answer this question would be great. If you can't, I would be very happy if you'd write to the Commission. Could you give us an update on the EU infraction proceedings on the 2.7 billion euros VAT that the EU claim was under-collected from various goods in relation to from China?
Again, I think Jim's been leading on that, so if you wouldn't mind.
I mean, the position remains as it did before when we gave previous updates, which is that the UK does not recognise either the liability or the quantification of the supposed liability, because we believe we took all reasonable steps to collect the duties that were due, and also because we do not believe that the methodology that has been used is a valid methodology for arriving at a figure of the duty at stake. But that infraction has not been withdrawn by the EU, so that remains the place, but our position has not changed on that.
But you've had the second letter now?
Yes, I mean, engagement continues. That process still trundles on, but our position is unchanged from what we've said before.
Okay. Anne-Marie Morris.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Franklin, you've got a huge challenge here because we're still in the world of unknowns, because while Mr Hara and I think Mr Thompson identify simplification, because we've got one option plus clearly a WTO option, we still don't know what the EU are going to suggest. So I'm kind of a bit curious as to why you're not actually still looking at what you might need to do to CDS and indeed the legacy system, just in case any of those or any variants come back. I mean, how much flexibility have you really got, Mr Franklin, because you really don't know what's going to happen.
So I think it is, first of all, worth reminding ourselves as what was the purpose of CDS in the first place. First of all, is there to replace an ageing system called SHIF. The second one is to make it compliant with the Union Customs Code. European Union legislation, then many of the, if not all of the simplification measures are being transferred into UK customs law. So we still need to be compliant with that legislation, and we still need to replace chief. And so in many respects, whatever happens in March 2019, March 19, we need to do this with CDS.
True, but what's your flexibility? How quickly can you react once you know where it's going to be?
Yeah, so
Exactly.
The way the technology that's been put in place for CDS does give us far more scope and agility when it comes to making change. It is one of the reasons why we need to move from chief to the CDS system anyway.
How quickly? How quickly?
So changes in chief that happen now can take hours. In CDS, they will take minutes.
So for the average change, you're better at specifying one than I am. How long would it take? 2 days?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
For the average sort of change that whichever option we arrive with happens, how long? Because it's not in minutes, it'll be hours and days, won't it?
So perhaps a good example would be, let's say that the UK decided to set its own set of tariffs. How long would that take?
Yeah.
We believe the answer is 7 hours.
Okay, but that's for you to practically do it. So there's a policy decision would have to be made.
Sure.
And then delivered through. So
I thought we were answering the question about how flexible the system is.
absolutely. So, but winding back from that then, so government makes a decision one day. How long is the running time till you to deliver that technical change that you would need? I mean,
depends on the change.
In terms of CDS being able to accept a UK tariff rather than an EU tariff, that project is already in train.
Right.
It's part of the Border Systems programme, and that is due to be delivered in time for the 29th of March next year, so that if the UK leaves the EU with no deal, we can set up a UK tariff from that date. Under the new model, that would need to be amended, because if we negotiate to come out of the implementation period in December 2020 with the UK collecting either a UK tariff or an EU tariff depending on the destination of the goods, then there will be a different change required to CDS so that it can have both of those tariff sets sitting on it, and that is something that we've already scoped out, but it's not in delivery at this stage because there's still negotiations to be carried out and to
But it'll only be 7 hours. You're saying 7 hours, whichever way.
to load a new tariff.
Okay. And how much longer for the system to operate? Because you've got HMRC to be trained up, you've got the customers to be trained up, because in a sense they're as confused as you are.
So again, it depends on what the change is, but changing the tariff, this system works system to system, so changing the tariff is once you put it, the tariff
what's more
through,
complicated?
it
What
works
about a more
automatically.
complicated one?
Say again?
Give us an example of something that's a bit more complicated.
So the more
system.
complicated scenario is the facilitated customs arrangement, where if you run 2 sets of tariffs, in which case we need to build an entirely new tariff system to run 2 alternative systems, and that takes some considerable time.
Well, how long is some time?
Well, we already have scoped out a plan to deliver that by the end of the implementation period in December 2020. That involves both our system changes and, you're right, that traders would need to make changes to their business processes. What happens at the moment is they look at one tariff and decide what is the rate of tariff that applies to their import. In the future, they will have to decide which of 2 tariffs applies to their import based on what they know about the destination of the import. So there's a different set of business rules that they will need to follow.
But you're assuming that we've got the luxury until 2020, and right now there are absolutely no guarantees about anything.
No, we're not assuming that. So if we leave with no deal, there will not be EU tariff and UK tariff. There will just be the UK tariff. The project to deliver that is already in train in the Border Systems programme and will be ready by March 2019. But if we were to move to the new model where you've got 2 tariffs on the system, we've already scoped making that change for end of December 2020.
Just bring you to Jeffrey.
Mr. Thompson, the real crunch is if we get a no deal, the system has to work and the suppliers have to be compatible with it by the 29th of March. So from this report, we see that the last technical rollout of CDS is not due until January. Is that going to give enough time between January and March to get the suppliers fully conversant with the new system and their systems compatible with it?
So probably not, to be upfront about it, for all traders, but perhaps I could refer you to figure 3, which is the NAO's assessment of the risks and an update of those risks.
Could you give us an update of the risks? Because this seems to be the real crunch.
So I'll try and answer your question. Absolutely. So the The area where the NAO comment that we've accelerated arrangements is that in relation to the full contingency. So in other words, building chief to handle a capacity of 300 million transactions a year or 100 million transactions a second. Now, at the point when testing demonstrates that chief can handle 300 million transactions, then risk number 5 on this list would clearly reduce because you now have a full contingency in chief. But it also impacts then on 2 other risks, the timetable and the stakeholder engagement. And at the point when you know chief can handle every transaction, as it were, then the pressure on the timetable and the migration reduces somewhat significantly, because everyone does not have to be on by January, because you could run both the systems concurrently, and at that point you'd have a capacity of 600 million actually. So you wouldn't, the pressure to migrate at that point reduces significantly. Does that make sense?
It absolutely, and that's really helpful. But so going back to the previous hearing, and indeed this hearing, it all depends on when you can be absolutely certain that chief will handle that extra work, and when will we get to that point?
So I believe that we're in testing now, and that we'll have the first results by the end of July about whether it can handle the 300 million. At that point, there's a little bit of further work to be done, so I believe it's September, but Heather may have to correct me on the September date.
No, it is September. I mean, the system, the upgrade to chief has already been built by Fujitsu, and they are already claiming that it can cope with 300 million declarations, and I'm sure that's absolutely right. We will now put it into our own test harness and test that for ourselves. We will make sure it's to the specification that is required to service our customers. As Mr. Thompson has already said, we will understand. The first assessment of that will be end of this month. But we will run 4 test iterations on that to evaluate that, and by the end of September we will have a very clear view of Chief's ability to be able to cope with that degree of change.
So there's not very much room for slippage in either of the systems, is there? That's one of the part we conclude.
Correct, and I think we would agree with the risk assessment, which is in Figure 3. We take a slightly different risk assessment, but we would agree with the risks in Figure 3. I think what we're pointing out is at the point when you've got a full contingency, it fairly significantly changes the overall risk matrix here. Some of the pressure about Release 2, Release 3 and dates and so on reduces. We also have the option, I think it's worth pointing out, that we can run chief for some considerable time beyond January 19. Kevin can give you the exact details, but we think we can run it well into 2020. So at that point, the whole January 2019 issue, frankly, becomes secondary to you've got a full operating chief to the full capacity you need.
So, Jeffrey.
So there are 2 further questions, important questions. Firstly, are there any quirks in a no-deal situation in the WTO system that actually will require you to modify chief? Because it's one thing getting it up to the capacity to be able to do the transactions. It's another thing if you've got to actually start to modify an old system.
I wouldn't know, Kevin, do you have a view?
No, there are no questions. So the way in which we've been designing CDS is not only is it compatible with the Union Customs Code, but it's also compatible with World Customs Organization standards and rules. And they're the things that govern the customs controls and the data elements that go into a customs declaration. So we would have no issue with the World Trade Organization rules either. Similarly, at the moment, Chief will accept customs declarations that meet the standards of the World Customs Organization. To be absolutely transparent, what Chief does not do and will not do on March 29th, 2019 is to have all of the functionality that's demanded by the Union Customs Code. But we have a window in terms of the movement from Chief to CDS area. So regardless of Brexit and the implications of Brexit, that is a period of time to deliver this between 2017 and 2020 for imports and 2023 for exports. So Chief will still be compliant with the current rules even after March 2019.
And if in the event of a no deal, there are going to be a whole lot of other people, importers directly from the EU, that will have to be brought into one or other system. Do you think that you will have had sufficient engagement with them to make sure that their systems and their knowledge will be compatible with one or other of the systems by March 29th of March 19?
So this is one of the key risks, which is set out again in Figure 3, because in the no-deal scenario, we have between 145,000 and 250,000 businesses who currently trade intra-EU. We know it's at least 145,000 because they're above the VAT threshold, and we have to make some estimate of the number of businesses who are trading intra-EU. Below the VAT threshold, we've advised ministers of 100,000. Now, that is a key group where we are not currently engaged in any kind of communications. And the reason for that is because ministers have been very mindful that in engaging with potential new customers for a no-deal scenario, obviously they need to balance that against the ongoing negotiations with the European Union. In the light of Chequers, we've been asked to provide some further advice about what we would do to start communicating with existing customers and with potential new customers. And we're in the middle of a dialogue with ministers.
So is there a systemic risk there that those customers might not be properly compatible with the system by 29th of March?
Yes, because they're not currently customers at all.
Yeah.
Yes, there is a risk.
And that's where you get to you now have to do customs declarations when you previously didn't have to do them under because we're members of the customs union. And this is where you get into the cost of it and so on.
So what's the implications if we can't get all of those on the system by the 29th of March?
I mean, first of all, in terms of system scaling, we will have both. We aim to both scale CDS and scale Chief to be able to cope with the volumes of declarations that group will produce. So we've got both the CDS system and the contingency in place able to deal with that. The key thing that we need to do is to make sure those people are aware of their new obligations and how they can fulfil them. And that is the work that John has described, that we are engaging with ministers as part of the ramping up of planning for no deal. We will want to make sure that they can access the guidance that tells them what they need to do and have time to acquire software or acquire an agent, whatever it is they require, to enable them to fulfil their obligations and, of course, make them aware of any new tariffs that they will have to pay as a result of us leaving the no deal.
Before I go back to Ms Morris, Mr Franklin, Mr Thompson said you broadly agree with the risks you agree with the agreed report. What's the thing that keeps you awake at night? What could go most wrong with this now? I mean, there's obviously no deal. That's a huge. Presumably that keeps you awake. But anything else?
Yeah. So one of I think we said this at the last hearing. The system development of this size and shape, the integration of multiple technology components and making that work in a live environment will remain a risk until we have completed it. Yeah. One of the things that gives me encouragement, though, is that we have already integrated those technology components into a production environment, a live environment, and we are already running performance testing on that. And to date, we're not seeing major development issues. However, with the nature of this type of IT program, there are always going to be things that come up. And we have had, again, I think it's highlighted in the report, and I'd be transparent about it, we have had some issues with the access security we want to place on our cloud-based technology. We've had to put recovery plans in place to make sure we get through that. We have identified some gaps between the major component, which is the declaration management system, which is the heart and soul of CDS, the core product, and what we want to do to maintain and then enhance UK trade facilitations, and so we are having to work through those. So the thing that can always pop up that we had not seen as a consequence of integration building is one thing. Second thing is that I am confident about the ability to deal with 300 million declarations because the infrastructure is already tested to do that. We now need to run that in a performance system to ensure it provides the same sort of response times that we get currently and improve those.
So quite a lot then.
So yeah.
I
I don't sleep.
Can we answer your question?
Yeah.
So I think the thing that hasn't come out is that we have a core dependency
You
on
sleep well at night, Mr. Thompson.
me. Well, I've lost £35 this year because of worrying about Brexit. The key dependency we have here is on IBM, the core contractor, and the report refers obliquely to ongoing discussions with the contractor, without saying IBM, but I think it's appropriate that I can say that. We need IBM to stick to the timetable that they agreed, which is then reflected in the timetable of the delivery of this project. That is a key dependency for us, and we continue to have high-level conversations about keeping them accountable for their element of the delivery of this project. That's the thing that keeps me awake at night.
Okay. Ms. Morris.
Well, that's very interesting. So what steps can you take to make sure that IBM get it right? What sort of meetings, what sort of assurances, what are you doing to make sure that this risk is minimised?
So I'm sure Kevin can tell you about the ongoing working practices, but we've accelerated this to the level of chief executive to chief executive because this is a mission-critical project.
And are there any financial penalties? Are the financial penalties on them sufficient to give them some good reason to meet this?
I don't think the financial penalties in the contract that we have for this particular product is sufficient to do that. Look, we ought to be clear. IBM are, they are doing their best. There is no doubt about that. We have IBM people on site with the development team in Southend. I'm having regular checkpoint meetings with their senior executives. They are doing everything that they can. But, we have found that there is some difficulty, they are finding some difficulty in trying to close the gaps between the core product and the things that we want to do in the UK around some of the trade facilitation measures, particularly on exports. On imports, it's not an issue at this stage, but on exports, so our Release 3 is dependent upon us closing those gaps. And so we are collaborating. I think it would not help us to get into some contractual battle with IBM. We need to work in partnership with them. We are doing that. But the leverage that we are now applying is that we are wanting to talk directly to the subcontractors, Intrasoft in Athens. We've got the Chief Executive Exchange. So they're the sort of levers that we are pulling.
So in terms of risk, on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is dreadful and 1 is 0, where would you rate it?
So seriously, at the moment, I think in the stage of discussions that we're having, it is probably 4 or 5.
Okay.
You have to link this conversation back to Sir Geoffrey's questions about, okay, so let's say ultimately that this is the third release isn't in January and it moves slightly back. At the point you have a fully operating chief, it matters, but it doesn't matter anywhere near as significantly as if you don't have a full contingency.
So let's just look at this, because you're effectively saying you've been given the heads up, go ahead, go talk to the customers, the clients, the users, and get them up to speed. However, what are you telling them? Because you don't know what it is they need to get up to speed with. You don't know what software you need to tell them to buy, because you don't know what's going to happen.
Just to be clear, I didn't say that at all.
Right.
What I said was ministers have asked us for some further advice about who we should communicate with, when and what should we communicate. That's what we've been asked for in the light of Chuckers.
Okay. In which case, let me ask the question differently. Regardless of what the PM and our team has said to you, clearly there's an issue about your communication with these companies that are going to have to get themselves sorted. And right now, you don't know what it is you tell them to do, or what software needs to be installed, or indeed trying to give them the support that you need, never mind the ones that aren't getting support at all. So it seems to me that you're between a rock and a hard place. You can't do anything.
Well, this scenario only arises in day one, no deal.
But it might arise.
Yes, it might arise, and therefore ministers have asked us for some further advice. We will give them some advice, and then they can make a decision, and then we can implement whatever action.
Any idea how long all of this is going to take? Because
we've been asked, in the light of what the Prime Minister said, post-Checkers, we've been asked to give some advice, and we will give them some advice about how we would do it, how long it would take, when we would do it, and who would.
I think in terms of timings, I mean, clearly, the more time you give people and the more you communicate to make sure that they are aware and have time to prepare, the greater the likelihood that they will be ready. However, in terms of actually asking these EU-only traders to take action, our view is that at this point we would not require them to take any action. That would be later on. So I think, if and when we do communicate with them about the prospect of no deal, initially what we'd be wanting to do is to make them aware of the implications for them of no deal, direct them to where they can become familiar with what those implications may be and get prepared. Later we would come back to them and say, now here's what you need to start doing.
Okay. Caroline Flint.
Presumably, if there is some sort of deal, then if, in terms of timing, the transition period would come into play. But in the in the situation of a no deal, would there still be, if you like, a transition possibility following a no deal situation as well, which would benefit both sides?
So our no deal planning is based on the UK leaving the EU on the 29th of March 2019 with no agreement, and therefore a UK only customs system being applied. You're right that the more likely prospect is that there is a withdrawal agreement, and therefore we go into that implementation period up to December 2020, at the end of which we will implement whatever's been negotiated. There must be a possibility that at the end of that you have no deal, but that's our no deal planning is for March 2019.
Okay, just Ms. Flint was asking that if you had no deal, there could still be a negotiation that, even with no deal, it's a slightly slower withdrawal. You're saying that's can you just be clear that there's no plans in?
It's theoretically possible that if there was a no deal, you could say, for argument's sake, for both the UK and the EU side, there's a 6-month transition to the new arrangements of all the declarations.
That would be for others to agree.
But that's theoretically possible.
We have to plan on the basis of a March 2019 exit.
So can you give us an idea how long it would take from the point at which, say, there was a decision on no deal, or it was obvious there was going to be no deal, how long it would take to get all those people up, all those organisations, stakeholders, up and ready? You've given some indication of practically what you would do. How long would you take? And if you had this 6 months that Ms. Flint stated, would that, I'm sure it would help, but how much time would you need in an ideal world?
It's not an absolute thing. The shorter the time frame you give these people, the more of them will not be ready on the first day, and therefore the more of them will feel that their trade has been disrupted. Therefore I would want the maximum amount of time I can possibly get to get them ready. Certainly.
What's the minimum amount of time you could get away with?
I mean, I think the minimum is, in the autumn winter of this year, if we are not telling them the actions that they need to take, then you're going to get an increasingly disrupted day one.
Very quick one from Ms. Keegan and then straight to Ms. Morris.
Just a quick one. So I think you talk about EU-only traders, smaller ones. So if I get that, if the longer the period of time, the more chance they've got of getting compliant with the system. What's the implications of them not being compliant with the system? Is it just foregoing some revenue, or not that that's a just, but is it foregoing revenue, or do you have some liabilities, or do they have liabilities? What's the implication of them not being ready to interface with Chief, I guess, in this case?
So the obligation on them is that they make a declaration before their goods hit the border. That is something that is both relevant to us in the case of imports into the UK. It's also relevant to UK exports to the EU, because they will expect there to be a declaration, and that they are ready to pay any liability that they may have if there's a tariff due. So the key risk is that they will not do one or other of those things. They will fail to make the correct declaration, or they will fail to make the payment. From the UK's perspective, you're then into how you want to manage that compliance risk, and how you want to balance the way you manage that against keeping trade flowing into the UK. We would certainly want to educate people in that circumstance to make sure that they know for the future what it is they need to do. We would want to collect any revenue that had not been accounted for. But certainly I think in the early days my aim would be to educate people and help them to comply, rather than to go in with a heavy hand on day one in an enforcement sense.
And there's no WTO enforcement requirements on you?
Well, the WTO expect all countries to operate customs controls on goods that move across their border, and clearly that's what we would be doing.
Which we wouldn't be doing, would we, if it wasn't working?
But it might occur on the other side of the border.
Could do.
So one of the key risks on the border is about how will member states operate controls with the UK. I think we talked about that in this committee before. That's definitely one of the three big border issues.
Right, but before we leave CDS specifically, we've got the delay, and we've got therefore a system which isn't going to be fully functional, and then we've got 3 separate, if you like, update programs. How critical are each of those?
The 3 releases.
Yeah, the 3 releases. Yeah, August, September, etc. So, I mean, how much lack of capability we're going to have, and how crucial is it going to be? So if we only get to the first additional release, how vulnerable are we, given all the things you've just talked about? Then the second release, how vulnerable are we?
So the first release next month, we've got a very high level of confidence about landing that. That will give us the functionality that would cope with about 80% of all import declarations, supplementary import declarations. The second release then covers the rest of import declarations, and the third release covers exports. And of course, it would be possible to implement, for example, the 2 import releases, and then, in the event that that export release was late, to continue using Chief for exports. That's not our plan. Our plan is to bring it in on time, but there are a range of contingencies around that.
So could you be looking at using both systems at the same time, one for imports, one for exports?
Well, that's actually part of our plan A, is to dual run both systems. Yeah.
And that was always a fun.
Right, okay. And your customers are going to have a real challenge, it seems to be, because that's adding complexity, isn't it? Or particularly the ones you're not specifically supporting.
We have to be, again, very honest about this. The migration from Chief to CDS is a complex business, and as was the migration from Chief's predecessor, DEPS, to Chief 25 years ago. So there will be some disruption, not to international trade, but to the business processes and procedures of intermediaries and the businesses. But we are putting quite a lot in place to handhold those organisations that need to migrate in a controlled migration way. So we talk about these very big numbers, but in actual fact, when you look at the number of declarants that there are on Chief, it is 8,700 declarants. In 2017, there were only 4,000 declarants, because these are very intermediary-based business, and then those 8,700, which will be a mixture of fast parcel operators, freight forwarders, imports, exports, and so on, will look after the 140,000 existing users, and you would expect those current intra-EU businesses to think about whether or not they might adopt a customs agent or go through an intermediary. So that's not to say that we ignore the rest, because we are already started, and we are running targeted communication campaigns where we're allowed to with the existing Chief users, and a whole range of things that we're doing on that. And we've appointed specific teams, business relation management teams, in place to handhold the controlled migration. 135 traders that will go through releases 1 and 2 for imports, which cover off 80% of current declarations anyway, and for exports as well. So we're putting quite a lot in place to help and handhold the different communities as we go through this.
My concern is that, although you may say it's 80%, actually one of the challenges for us, industrial strategy, increasing productivity, is export. That's the last piece of all this, and actually it's those smaller entrepreneurial businesses that are going to be key to our strength and growth. I'm not entirely clear how they really are going to be able to help, because it's not about 20% in terms of value or volume. A lot of that is going to be individual returns by an awful lot of different businesses.
I think we recognise that. I think we're trying to be realistic with you about, we completely recognise that risk. We're being asked by ministers to give some advice about how we would go about addressing that question. We're in the middle of that conversation. I think one of the things which is slightly missing on figure number 1, which I think is rather excellent way of setting it all out, is 2 things. One of which is the 8,700 intermediaries, and the other is the vast majority of businesses do not interact with this system. They buy some software. There are 57 software products in the market. They don't interact directly with us, so they would buy a software product.
But these little businesses don't have an HR man and an IT man. I mean, they are on their own.
Yes, in which case they may well use an agent, and this is it's a highly intermediary rich environment. There are tens of thousands of customs agents who will do all of this work for you.
But you are right that in the case of EU-only traders, our research shows that they are largely small and medium-sized enterprises. Under the customs model that the government has decided that it wants to negotiate, there would be no additional burdens on them compared with today. But if we were to leave with no deal and customs controls were introduced with the EU, then we would have to help those businesses to cope with a new set of obligations that they would have to comply with.
And do you have a contingency plan to do just that?
Yes, so
have
we
you
have
got the people employed. How are you going to physically do it?
So we have our we do have a no deal planning, and as John mentioned, part of that is advising ministers about when and how to communicate with these people and what messages to give them. At this stage, there is no certainty that they will be impacted at all, because if we reach a withdrawal agreement, we will go into that implementation period up to December 2020, where everything continues as now as far as they're concerned. And if we negotiate the new model, everything will continue as now indefinitely. But the government has decided it would wants to ramp up people's readiness for the eventuality of no deal, and that's what we're currently advising ministers about how we could.
When do you need ministers to make a decision so you can actually do this?
Say again?
When do you need a decision for the ministers so that you can actually do this?
Well, as I said before, there's no particular date at which it has to stop. But in the autumn-winter time, we do definitely need to be telling people what they would need to do to be ready for March 2019.
And on which we're going to come back to the point on timetable when we get back from the vote. So, order. We'll be back and working again when there are four of us.
Giving us a reply with regard to the SMEs, and you're explaining how some of those, the very smallest of businesses, would indeed be vulnerable. My concern is, how much is it going to cost for each of those individual, very small businesses to go to the agents that you described, to buy the CD material? What are we exposing them to?
Yes, I mean, I think we have before given evidence about the costs of completing customs declarations, and that can be up to £55 per declaration. It depends on the nature of it, but that is the kind of
but
money.
What about buying software? I mean, there's the kind of setup bit rather than just the cost of doing it.
Yeah, and that is the ongoing cost of complying with customs can be between £45 and £55 per declaration that you have to make. You would expect small businesses to try to take that into account in terms of the number of declarations that they do make. However, the nature of the EU trade is, at the moment, certainly the static nature of it, is that it's a large number of small consignments, and therefore there's a potentially quite high cost for them. In relation to one of the previous models, we estimated that cost was between 12 and 13 billion pounds a year for the UK as a whole, and the greater part of that would fall on these traders who, for the first time, are having to engage with customs.
Because Ms. Morris asked earlier about the various deadlines that were in place. And you've got all of those coming in. You've got the costs coming into business. Are you looking across government? I suppose, Mr. Thompson, as your role as the border group,
yes,
at the costs to businesses of all these changes. So there's been the bonfire of the regulations. This could be a phoenix arising from those ashes, couldn't it? As you've got customs declarations, buying software, getting the customs agents in, just that alone. And there must be other aspects of border control.
I think the cost of introducing customs declarations for the 200 million additional customs declarations is the dominant one by some considerable margin. I think I've given evidence before that our estimate is 17 to 20 billion pounds a year of additional administrative burden on UK businesses for complying.
So is there anywhere in the system that's going to try and mitigate against that? Because that's just that aspect alone is a big burden.
It's difficult to see how you would mitigate it against it. And if we... So to be really clear, we're talking about a scenario where we are leaving the European Union with no deal. That's not the government's preferred option. But we're exploring day one no deal. So in the spirit of, I have to put that on the record because we need to be really clear about what we're saying. In that situation, you've got, our estimate is 205 million additional customs declarations. Actually, the cost is between, 20 and £55, depending on exactly what's being transported. There are broadly five groups of businesses, and it comes out at 17 to 20 billion pounds a year. That is to, of course, comply with the Union Customs Code and whatever requirements we would want, because now we're an independent nation under the WTO rules. We would require customs declarations for imports and export because we need to know what's being traded. So I think the broad estimate of 17 to 20 billion holds for day one no deal.
Okay, so there's
per year.
It's a huge burden on business. So in terms of the money that you make, do you make any money? When you charge people to go through the system, they have to make a declaration. How much are you covering costs? Are you getting full cost recovery?
We don't charge anyone for making a customs declaration.
You're not going to be charging anyone, so just be clear. So, okay,
yes,
maybe
that's the sort of commercial cost to them, either doing it themselves or hiring a freight forwarder or whoever would do it for them. I mean, what they might have to pay on top of that to us is any tariff that becomes due.
And VAT and VAT potentially.
So yes, I mean we've talked before about the cash flow issue of changing the VAT rules. So at the moment, where you import goods from the EU, we have postponed accounting for VAT, so there's no cash flow disadvantage to a business from bringing those goods in. They basically account for that VAT and get a deduction for it at the same time. If you import goods from the rest of the world, you would have to pay that import VAT before you would get your deduction. As a default, then that would apply when the EU becomes part of the rest of the world. But the Chancellor did announce it in the budget last autumn that he recognises that that's an issue and that he wants to work to a resolution on that, but there's been no announcement since then of what the decision will be.
So the uncertainties are rife. So Geoffrey, briefly.
So to be clear, it's not a quantum problem, it's a timing challenge.
Can you just repeat those figures again? The compliance costs for these extra businesses that are coming on board. Did I hear correctly that you're talking about 17 to 20 billion?
Yes.
To safeguard how many billions worth of tax?
Well, we currently collect about £28 billion of VAT a year, about £7 billion of excise and about £3.5 billion of customs duty. How much customs duty there would be in the future would depend on what the UK's tariff policy is, and of course there's now VAT on EU trade as well, which is not included in that £28 billion.
So again, if you referred to figure 1, the difference between the current 55 million declarations and the estimated 255 million, that is because of all of these businesses are currently on intra-EU trade. There is no paperwork. Now they have to do customs declarations. The cost is between £20 and £55. We break that up into 5 parts. I can take you through the methodology. It averages out at £32.50 per declaration. There are 56 fields in a customs declaration, up to 56 fields. For high volume automated businesses, the cost is at the lower end, and if you're a small business and you're doing it manually, it's at the higher end.
So that is a huge burden on small business. Isn't it going to put a lot of small businesses out of business? Because they'll simply be uncompetitive.
Well, you're asking us to speculate, and I'm just giving you the advice.
Yeah, I think that goes beyond.
Okay, but surely one of the fundamental principles of taxation is that it should be economic. The compliance cost should be economic. It doesn't sound to me as a compliance cost of 17 to 20 billion is an economic compliance cost for the amount of tax that you're actually collecting. So is this a one-off cost, or is this a...
No, it's annual.
Annual cost?
Yeah.
Do you really think this is a sensible taxation system?
Well, you're asking me what it costs, and I'm giving you the advice that we've given to ministers. I've set out that I can happily walk you through the calculation in some considerable detail. What is the research that underpins it? There are 3 independent reports and so on. I'm very happy to do it, but it's 17 to 20 billion a year because you're moving from a frictionless intra-EU customs union.
I think, Mr. Johnson, we know. I mean, what we're dealing with is, of course, is a decision that the British people made, and that's being implemented by ministers. And I think that's the challenge.
I
think the points have been made.
But in terms of being sensible, I mean, the government has been clear that in arriving at a new customs arrangement, when we leave the customs union, they want to avoid those frictional costs, and that is one of the reasons for the model that they have produced. One of the key reasons for it.
But have you given this advice clearly to ministers? Perhaps.
Yes,
that's partly why check is made.
Yeah. So that everybody, because these are the first time I've heard these figures in the public domain.
Well, I think there was a point when I first told the Treasury Select Committee that it was fairly high up the news.
Yeah, no, I think we've had some, perhaps not. We've been discussing slightly different figures today. We add them up, I think, much the same. Ms. Morris.
Thank you. So could you be a bit more specific about what sort of help you're going to give these little businesses? Because sticking something on the internet, one, they may not have the internet, isn't really, I think, where it needs to be.
So these EU-only traders fall into 2 categories in terms of us being able to reach them with help. For 145,000 of them, we know who they are, we know where they live or where they do business, so we can engage with them directly to make them aware of what potentially they would need to do in the event of no deal. And I must stress, this is all in the event of no deal. And therefore our aim would be direct communication with them initially. to raise their awareness of what the implications of no deal would be, and to encourage them to prepare, think about those implications and prepare, and then later on, if it looked like no deal was going to happen, we would be getting back in touch with them to tell them what it is we think they actually need to do in terms of a call for action. In between, we would be encouraging them to register for an email news alert service where we would be updating them with any information as we got it. There is another category of traders that John mentioned who they are below that VAT threshold. We estimate there could be as many as 100,000 of them, but we don't actually know their identities. There are 100,000 businesses in the 5 million that are out there. We would be reliant on sort of general communications to reach them through their trade bodies, whatever, to make them aware, because we cannot communicate with them directly because we don't know who they are.
Okay, are you going to use trade bodies, and if so, how small? Because some of the, if you like, national bodies don't reach the very smallest; they just have their local town bodies.
Yes, so we are, working through it at the moment, and as John said, engaging with ministers on what the approach to that would be and how we can zone in on those micros who are affected, and so that we can reach them. The 145,000 is easier. The 100,000, sort of, bothering 5 million businesses to try and find those 100,000. I think we have to achieve some kind of balance. But going through intermediaries, whether it be their accountant, whether it be their trade body, or the grocer magazine, or whatever their trade magazine is the kind of way that we would initially try to reach them.
And how early are you going to engage? Because you talked about a sort of series of engagements, but clearly you don't know, neither do we, until we get there, whether there's going to be no deal. So
Yeah.
how many days, weeks, months ahead of that are you going to make your first communication?
So if we engaged with them now, it would be to raise their awareness of the risk of no deal.
When you say now, you mean now?
Yes, I mean, what we would do at this stage, if we were communicating with them, would be to raise their awareness of the possibility of no deal and the implications of that.
But I'm asking you, when are you going to... You say that if I was doing it now,
Yes,
this is what I would do.
clear,
When are you going to do it? Because we know when drop dead day is,
Okay.
but when?
Yeah.
To be clear, we're going to give ministers some advice.
So I
But
can't
we're
tell,
not going to, we can't tell you at the minute.
I can't tell you that at the moment.
Okay. What about staffing? Because you're going to need quite a lot of people to help with all of this lot.
So
have you got the budget for it? Have you got the people for it? When are you going to recruit them?
So I think I've been reasonably clear that in these various scenarios we would need somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 additional staff.
It's a lot.
We've recruited 1,113 by
Which
the
is
end
not
of
many.
May.
Right.
We have 1,570 offers of employment out, so that's taken us to 2,700, and we're continuing to recruit en route towards the 4,000 to 5,000.
And how confident are you you're going to get all the recruits you need on time?
Definitely.
You're definitely... Well,
We have 4,000 people on a waiting list who'd like to join HMRC.
Right, and once you've got them employed, you've still got to train them.
We
How
do.
is that going to take?
It depends what they're going to do. So if they're going to work on in a national customs hub, then it's shorter than if they're going to work on customer compliance, which is further downstream, because that's more complicated, because it involves risking information and deciding which businesses that you're going to do a compliance review.
So you'll be able to deliver the training on time?
So in relation to the national... well, that's a different question. So in relation to training, our estimate, I believe, is 3,000 people need to be trained, 2,500 HMRC colleagues and 500 Border Force colleagues.
And how long will it take you to do that?
Kevin,
Mr.
do you have a
Franklin.
view about how long it would take to train?
Again, it depends on the type of work they're doing. So if a Border Force officer is engaged in intelligence, that would take longer than...
Yeah, well, how long's longer? We'd like some numbers.
range.
When I was directing the Border Force, to train an officer would take between 6 and 12 weeks.
If the question you're really asking is this going to be an optimal system on the 1st of April
I just want to know that it'll work or fall
2019?
over.
The answer is it's not. It's not going to be optimal, and after 2019, in the scenario that you're exploring of day one, no deal, we would continue to mature the system through 2019 and 2020, get more people and so on and so forth. But we believe you'd have a functioning border, but it would not be an optimal situation.
Right.
I should just add on.
And I think the three of us have been consistent about that on multiple occasions, including with you.
So
I should just add on the resourcing. Sorry, that that is resourcing in the HMRC. Border Force are obviously critical to the implementation of the customs system. They also are slightly ahead of us actually in recruiting officers to add to their force at the border as well. So you need to bring those two together to see the total additional resources on customs.
So if you were sitting here asking for, you've given your caveats, you can't be sure it's going to be optimal on day one and all the rest of it, a number of others. So what could or would you like from other bits of government like Treasury, and take aside ministerial decisions because we can't get into that here, that would make this deliver better? Is there anything that could be done that could make this work more smoothly? That's outside your immediate control.
I think we have excellent pan-Whitehall arrangements for working together and so on. I don't think there's anything we require from another government department.
What about the Treasury then?
But,
are you giving you the opening door to bid for more funding, Mr Thompson?
And we're going to open the bid. Well, look, we've been given £260 million. Whether that is enough in the current year or not depends on how the policy eventually settles down. The key issue that arises is the so-called, I think the phrase that's been used is sorry. That's all right. I was going to say, I think the issue that you would then run into is how do you've got three objectives at the border: security, the flow of trade and the raising of revenue, and the ministers could, in extremis, in the run-up to 1st of April 2019, make some decisions about which of those three objectives you might have to trade. But that balance of those three objectives exists right now, and the dynamic might change in 2019 under a day one no deal.
So, Thompson, in paragraph 1.12, if my maths is correct, that paragraph indicates you need 342 million without the 53 million from the Border Systems Programme. Have you got those resources from Treasury?
Can you do that again?
So, if you add up those figures in paragraph 1.12 on page 15, yes. 270 plus 60 plus 12 is 342 million. Plus the separately the 53 million from the Border Systems Programme. Is that money that you've already been allocated from the Treasury, or is that a wish list?
So the £270 million.
Yes, 270.
Set out in figure 4 is a multi-year cost. So that's spread over several years, all the way to 2022.
Right.
So at the minute, the way in which Brexit is being funded by the Treasury is in an annual allocation.
Yes.
So we have an allocation of 260 for 18-19. There's a debate within HMRC about whether that is or is not sufficient for the current year, because there are still obviously ongoing policy considerations. So, for example, to go back to an earlier conversation, under various scenarios, the Border Systems Programme might get smaller, in which case the costs will go lower. So for us, 260 million, if we did everything that ministers want, 260 million is insufficient. And but there are plausible scenarios where the policy changes over the next few months, and 260 million would be plenty.
We should explain that the CDS programme separately was funded in the 2015 spending review, because of course we were intending to do that programme before the referendum. So the 260 million we've been given for Brexit this year is on top of the allocation that we got for CDS.
So in the worst case scenario, the most complicated system, how much short will you be?
In the current year?
Yes.
For Brexit?
Yes.
Could be as high as 70.
70
million.
Yeah, 70 million. Yeah.
So if we did everything that was currently on the table, and bearing in mind the policy scenario continues to develop, then it could be as much as 70 million out, but some of those policies are unlikely to occur.
Yeah, so the quicker decisions are made, the cheaper it is for the taxpayer. Ms Morris.
The Border Systems Programme, we have touched on that a bit, but we've not really drilled down. As far as I understand, that's the area you have quite a lot of concern over. Could you perhaps just articulate clearly what the three biggest risks are in that area? So
rather brilliantly, Kevin's also the Programme Director for Border Systems Programme, so perhaps Kevin would like to answer your question.
Yeah. So there are 9 projects inside the Border Systems Programme. They range from an uplift of capability to some internal systems through to what are the biggest areas that we are working on. That would be, what do we do at roll-on, roll-off ports? Yeah. What do we do in Ireland? And what do we do around community transit? Because community transit is a significant simplification measure that is currently enjoyed by thousands of businesses. So they are the three biggest areas.
And where have we got to with the row piece?
So with in terms of a day one no deal, it would be another suboptimal solution, but we do have a suboptimal solution in so much that we would be taking customs declarations through Chief or CDS. What we wouldn't be able to do by that time is to tie that to the movement of the goods. What we need to be able to do that is the deployment of some form of inventory system that enables us to link that. But our longer term plan is that we would be able to deploy an inventory based solution at roll on roll off ports certainly by 2020. Much will be.
Explain what that would look like. I mean,
so it depends on what it's look like. I was just about to say, it depends on what that would look like. It depends on where we are in terms of the new model that will evolve. It'll also depend on the range of other actors in the supply chain that need to do work to do this. So a community service provider, which is the organisation that runs port systems, for example, owns and deploys inventory systems currently. If they were to be asked to do something similar at Dover, they will need a lead-in time. They've told me probably 9 to 12 months. So, there are other dependencies here. So we've got those same organisations working on other priorities. CDS is a good example, and of course we need to take into account their ability to deliver against these timelines as well. Alignment tension amongst these various components is probably the biggest challenge that I have.
How are you going to manage that challenge? How are you going to make these decisions about what you do when, where you spend the money you've got, or haven't got, as the case may be?
So we've already got an allocation of money. So the Border Systems Programme itself is all about systems that need to be ready in the event of a day one no deal situation, and we have got an allocation money for that already. So those projects are already in flight.
But just to simplify, the issue at the moment with no customs control at the moment on all of those roll-on, roll-off services. As things currently stand, they do not have any inventory systems in place, so that if in no deal we start getting customs declarations on day one, an importer may give us a declaration, but we are unable to link that to a particular lorry on a particular ferry. So we need the ferry operators and the ports and the hauliers to implement inventory systems that enables us to connect the customs declaration that we receive to the movement of a vehicle with the goods on it. That will be for them to do. There's not very much of this is actually done in government. It has to be done in the industry. We have shared with them the sort of technical specification of what it is that they will need to do in the event that this comes about. We did that in March. We've since March been engaging with them on making sure they understand that technical specification, making sure we understand its implications for them, and we've actually now sent them a second iteration of that specification. So we've shared with them all the technical detail that we can, but of course they continue to work under the uncertainty of whether any of it is going to be needed, because under the model that the government wishes to negotiate, none of it is required.
Right. At what point do you actually call stumps and say we're too close to sort of going out with no deal, that actually we say do it, put the programme in?
So already our view is that it is too late to have these inventory systems in place for March 2019 where they do not exist, which is why we would start on day one with a suboptimal system where we cannot link declarations easily with movements, and we will try to manage that in a risk-based way. So we would be talking about implementing improvements to that over time, and the ports effectively being required to do.
But in terms of the ports and what they need to do, are you not going to tell them to make any change unless we actually get to D-Day?
Well, at this point, I'm not in a position to mandate them to do anything.
But presumably you're talking to the government in terms of...
Sure. Yeah, but there's no law in place saying that this is the customs model that they have to operate. There's no certainty that it is. It will cost them a lot, a considerable amount of money and a considerable amount of time to do it. The point has already passed where that could be in place for March 19.
So I mean, just to be really clear, on day one, let's say no deal. D-Day is already passed. Well, the pre-planning deadline for D-Day for a lot of this is already passed. So there will have to be a leniency on the ports and others not being able to comply with customs fully, because it will not be physically possible to do the inventory checks and certain other checks.
It will be possible for people to comply. We will have the ability for importers to make their declarations. It will be difficult for us and Border Force to police the compliance risks in relation to that in the way that we would like. Can I just be clear then?
Forgive me, I can't now remember the exact rules. But if you're a port or indeed a freight provider and goods are coming in illegally in your, just like you have illegal migrants, you get fined for that if you're the lorry driver. Is there no? There isn't. I think is there not some sanction for facilitating goods coming in which are breaking customs rules?
I mean, the obligation is on the importer to make the declaration and to pay any tariff. We can place administrative obligations on ports and carriers in terms of the facilities that they have to make available.
You really practically cannot do that now in time?
We would acknowledge that when it comes to implementing inventory systems, there is not time for all the ports and operators to do that for March 19. And in any event, I do not have the ability to require them to do that at this point.
So we're going to see potentially goods coming through the border with no control, no checking, because
there will just be really clear.
So there will be controls.
The current situation.
Yeah.
Well,
so the question is, on day one, I'm not sure whether we debated this before. Is there any more risk to French wine in April 2019 than there is now?
Well,
because
it's not the French wine coming through; it's what people might put in instead of the French wine, I suppose.
Sure, but I understand that, but the security arrangements, which I know that you've got some doubts about, would be the same. The question then is about how you trade those three objectives, and do you think the risk has changed at all?
Okay, well, we have covered that. I remember reading the transcript only recently again about that. Can I just go back to the functionality upgrade dates that Ms Morris was talking about earlier? So August, September and December, Mr Franklin. So if everything goes well in August, you're on track for September and then potentially for December. But when will you know that you've hit presumably you won't know that you've hit the September upgrade functionality until December itself? So you could have a delay. You could have a delay as late as December on that third upgrade.
So yes, that is a risk. There is no doubt. So the acid test will be on when we launch the first release of this, which is due to be, the system will be ready on the 12th of August. We will launch it on the 14th of August. This is an iterative process, so that will take care of the majority of the technology platform that we will require for imports. And so we're then actually in a really good place to move relatively quickly to the second half of imports release 2. The issue that we are working on at the moment is making sure that we've got sufficient functionality in the export side of things, and that's the major risk that I'm facing.
But Mr Harry, in April this year, you told us that the last release should go in during July, and you described that as, broadly speaking, functionality complete. Yet we're now talking on December for that last release.
Yes, sorry. I think if I misled the committee, then I meant to refer to the build of the system. So the infrastructure for CDS will actually be complete, not in August, but actually this month. But you're right that the software drops are being phased after that. So
the functionality won't be complete until the software drops are in place.
Yes. So the system will be built. The infrastructure will be there, ready to receive first of all the first software, and then the first traders to migrate.
Okay. And Ms Franklin, I mean, one of the ways that any government department delivers projects on time is to reduce the scope if there's a challenge. Have you had to reduce the scope of anything since we started talking to you about this?
No, we've not reduced the scope. So when we last spoke, we were talking about we had set out our transition strategy, but we report and we agreed we still needed to develop a transition plan. There'll be 3 influencing factors in the evolution of that plan. One is the trade consultation that we have been through, and we have got, because this is such a diverse and complex industry, there are different communities and they are in a different state of trade readiness. So we need to acknowledge that and we need to accommodate that. So the approach of the 3 releases has allowed those companies and software developers and CSPs to look at how they can do that within their own technical and business capabilities. And that was a very strong representation from the industry, which we have accepted. The second influencing factor is something that I have already mentioned, and that is we have had some technology difficulties in getting access to the public cloud, which is the platform which we build that. We've recovered that now to preserve the August timeline, but we realised that we would need to defer some of that development work to enable us to preserve that August timeline, and that's what we've done. It does not reduce the scope in terms of our business case and what we wanted to do.
Delayed some of the breadth of service, effectively.
So by the time,
can you tell us what's been delayed as a result of that?
So for in release 1, it's all about supplementary declarations. So these are the declarations are made on a monthly basis or whatever it might be. There are so many different types of customs declarations, but this is something that does not affect release of goods at the border. So it is something that would enable the goods to go into a warehouse, for example. When you look at the data standards and the data model and the infrastructure needs to be put in place for a supplementary declaration, it is very similar to then what you need to put in place for a frontier declaration. So in release 2, when we've implemented all of that by November, that will then bring on board the frontier declaration. So you've effectively got supplementary declarations that allow goods to go into warehouse and temporary storage and some of these other simplification measures, and then by the time we get to release 2, that brings on the frontier declarations as well, and that brings CSPs into play.
Right, okay. And how long can Chief continue to run? It's more than 20 years old. Are you confident that it could keep going if necessary?
Yeah, I mean, there is no evidence to suggest that we don't have lots of unplanned outage, for example, on the current system. One of the reasons why we want to change it is because the technology is not as flexible and nimble.
We know it's old.
So the contract that we have with Fujitsu, we have extended that contract to March 2020. There are always options to extend it further if we would need to. We wouldn't want to continue to run with Chief for too long because that would just be expensive and not helpful to those traders that are using the systems anyway. But we've already extended the contract, as I say, to March 2020. So theoretically, that gives us a window to run in that period.
Okay, and you could extend it beyond that, but obviously at a cost.
Yes, we could.
I can't remember what the cost. I think there was some figures on the cost of extending it, but what's the figure? What would it cost to extend it by, say, another year? And would it be sensible to do it a year at a time? Or presumably there's a benefit if you were to extend it for a longer period of time.
Yeah.
Which we maintain the maintenance.
I mean, I don't have the actual number. I haven't got the figure in terms of what the extension cost would be.
It would be very helpful to have it.
Yeah, but we could write you on that.
I should also say on Chief's resilience, as part of the contingency planning, we have bought brand new infrastructure for Chief, and we'll be moving the live service onto that infrastructure in the autumn.
So that's bits of computer equipment.
Correct. So that they will be new, and therefore, that sort of helps with the resilience of the.
And do you know what that's cost?
Yes, so that's part of that. The Brexit costs that are in the NAO's report. So they're all part of that 53 million.
It's all part of that 53. Ms. Morris?
You did, when I asked you what were the challenges with regard to this piece, the border piece, you said Ireland was the second one. What will you do if there is a no deal in terms of ensuring that we don't have a hard border, but we recognise that, we're out?
So everything we've talked about in terms of no deal, so all of those extra customs declarations and the potential for checks, that applies to GB EU trade, and would also apply to Northern Ireland EU trade that is not using the land border. But the government is committed that at the land border they do not want to require the vast majority of traders to make customs declarations or to be subject to any routine checks or controls related to the border, and that is built into that day one plan. But it does involve us creating some bespoke systems for Northern Ireland traders, which are part of the Border Systems programme, so that we're able to support them to operate a different system from the rest of the UK's traders in relation to that land border trade. In essence, to enable them to identify themselves as international traders to whom the rules should not apply. And that is a brand new system that we need to create as part of that.
So that's not created yet?
No, that's part of the Board Assistance Programme. It is in train to be ready in March 19 to accommodate whatever day one plan that we put in specifically for Northern Ireland land border trade.
Has it been fully spec'd, and is somebody actually working on the development now?
In terms of what we want to do for day one, yes.
Okay.
In terms of what Ms. Harrow has just laid out, we have got a project team that is developing that solution.
And you would expect, therefore, there to be no risk that it won't be functional as at day one, D-Day, whatever?
There are always risks to all of these.
How big is the risk? Can you quantify it?
I'm not sure that I would be able to quantify. What I am confident about is that part of the solution will be a customs declaration system. We will have a customs declaration system in place. Part of the solution will be a registration service that is already being built as we speak. So I am confident that we could have the appropriate solution in place to support the policy that's just been laid out by Mr. Harrow by March 2019.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Keegan.
Just something you said there, Jim, about having a different land border system in Ireland in this scenario. Does that create some incentives for more traders to maybe come through that route as opposed to other routes? And can you track that or monitor that in any way?
Yes, the aim that the government has described in relation to even a negotiated solution where customs controls are reintroduced between the UK and the EU is that for low-value trade on the island of Ireland, that would be regarded as not really international trade. It would be regarded as trade in a local economy. There would be some fiscal risk around that, but it's very small. In economic terms, it is not a threat to the integrity of the UK or the EU. But of course, we would want to monitor that is being used by the people for whom it is intended and not being used for any other purpose.
Transporting the odd cow or sheep across the border is all right.
We don't want to apply. So, the example I always give is if there is a plumber in Newry going across to Dundalk to fix someone's bathroom with a bit of copper piping, I don't want him to have to make customs declaration for his copper piping going across the border. But if someone in, I don't want to pick a poor city in the UK, but in a city in England thinks I'm going to move several thousand tons of copper over there, we'll definitely want to make sure that does not happen there, not people who are supposed to be accessing that, and so we will want to manage the risks. We are already used to operating cross-border VAT and excise rules in Ireland, and we can do that and manage the risks without any border checks or border controls.
So just a follow-up, so if you're from Europe and you're trying to import and you're trying to avoid, because I assume these transaction costs we've talked about are equal on the other side of the border, so they'll be incurred for the small suppliers in other European countries.
If that was negotiated,
we gave you actually split. So the 17 to 20 is both sides of the transaction.
Both sides of the transaction.
Yeah.
Okay, so we wouldn't actually pick up all of that.
So we'd have half would be on the UK economy and half would be on
the other
EU.
So does it create an incentive for some of those SMEs to try and avoid some of those by coming through the Irish route?
I mean, that would be a risk that we would need to manage. We believe that you can create a system whereby it is only Irish small businesses that can access this exemption and that will only apply to low-value trade. For any more significant trade that crosses that border, normal customs declarations and any payment of any tariff would apply.
Yes, but we already established that you wouldn't have any enforcement for 9 or 12 months. So.
Well, we would certainly wish to collect that revenue. What the government has committed to is that it will not use routine border controls at the land border in order to do that.
That's a very interesting sentence to include both those statements in one. I appreciate it's not entirely your decision. Ministers have to make that. So, Geoffrey.
Mr. Thompson, last time you told us we know what the next steps are. There remain 4 risks in relation to the project. And specifically you mentioned how the system integrates with HMRC's other systems,
yes,
most notably accountancy and finance. Can you tell us how that is progressing and what the problems are?
So I'm sure Kevin can give you a bit more detail. I believe that we fixed the finance systems challenge that is referred to in the report We would ideally like it to integrate with what's now called the Enterprise Tax Management Platform, but we found a different way of fixing that particular problem. There are some other integration challenges, but I'm sure Kevin can tell you what they are.
Yeah, so we have fixed that finance problem in so much that we're using the existing accounting system, it's called CCAS. So from a CDS perspective, as long as we can account for the money, collect and account for the money, it doesn't matter, but we will be moving to the Enterprise Tax Management Platform at a later date. So that integration risk is not there. In terms of the integration of technology components, we put them into a live environment and we are pushing messages through that, and that is working. That also includes the interfaces with some of our other legacy systems. So for risk, for example, we have developed a risk solution that does work together with the Declaration Management Service. Much of the integration is contained within CDS itself. So long as we've got the 18 functional components and 8 core products integrated and working, then we are okay.
So paragraph 2.5 in relation to that CAS, yes. It says HMRC is still determining what work is required to integrate CDS with CCAS. Has that work been done or not?
Yeah, no, that work has been done. CDS, when CDS processes a customs declaration, the accounting side of it will be done through CCAS until such time the Enterprise Tax Management Platform is ready, and then we will switch that. One of the advantages of the technology that we're deploying in CDS is that will be done in the back office functions. It will not be visible to the trade, and then we can switch that relatively quickly.
That's in your 7-hour category of switch, is it? You were talking about these back office functions being done at the beginning of this hearing, could be done in 7 hours.
No, I said a tariff upload could be done in 7 hours.
So how long would it, so the gap quote, how long would the change like this take?
Well, yes.
So I don't know. I couldn't put a precise time on it. So no, we're talking days. Not
Can we just be slightly transparent with you about the architecture? So one of the challenges of HMRC is there are 317 different IT systems. The Enterprise Tax Management Platform is an SAP platform. The core architecture that we're trying to devise is to consolidate as many systems as we can onto SAP. In an ideal world, as per Para 2.5, we would ideally link CDS directly into the Enterprise Tax Management Platform, but in the interim, we have a functioning option to link it to CAS. So that will work. It's not optimal, and in due course, we will migrate from CCAS to the SAP product.
So one of the, so definitely want to come back to the final one, but you've got huge IT projects going on across HMRC anyway. You've got this. What's the biggest IT risk then? Does this have an impact on some of those other IT projects? Because you're kind of having to focus so much attention on getting this right on day one. I mean, I know you've got other priorities on day one too, but in terms of IT integration.
So this is the biggest technology project we currently have.
Yeah.
As you can see, it's £270 million. It's a multi-year project, and it's absolutely fundamental to our business.
But you've got your other internal things, like your customer service stuff. I mean, that's a big IT project. We do have
a wide range, and as you know, we've been through an extensive prioritisation process, and in tomorrow's annual report and accounts, the NAO comment fairly extensively on that process and what it is that we've had to stop.
Yeah.
Or defer in order to find the capacity and capability necessary to make sure that we can secure.
So it'll all be published tomorrow.
It is. I think there's a fairly extensive section.
Okay, we haven't seen that yet because it's being published tomorrow, so that's fine. We can. Okay. I think that's yes. White paper and your annual accounts. Well, we shall be. PAC will be burning the midnight oil as we read these exciting documents. So, thank you very much indeed for your time, gentlemen. Obviously, we wish this well, but we're quite staggered. I think you picked up from the committee about the additional burdens on business potentially. Almost whatever happens is going to be a burden. So I think that's been noted. Our report on this, what we do with this, will be coming out not until after the summer. But thank you very much for your time. Transcript, as ever, will be up on the website in the next couple of days. And we look forward to seeing you again on the 5th of September, I think.
I believe sorry?
5th or 12th of September, I think.
Okay, well, that's...
we're giving you early notice. There you go.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that.
If you haven't been notified, you will be very soon. So
thank you. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I know you want to go.